All right, guys, today I couldn't be more excited than to get to do a dual interview. I get to interview two authors who worked on the same book, and it is a good one. So I can't wait to introduce it to you. Let me explain this book, a little bit of the background behind it, and then these guys are going to kind of flesh out some of the themes, and it's going to be a lot of fun. The book is called Union, a Democrat, a Republican, and a Search for Common Ground by the authors Jordan Blashek and Christopher Haugh. So you can see some of the praise for this book. It really amazed me already that these guys have gotten a lot of endorsements for this book and the narrative that they put into it. So you can see Jim Maness has read it, talked about the lessons that it has for all of us. Bob Woodward, John Kerry, talking about how beautiful and breathtakingly honest this book has been. And you can see why when I introduce you to these authors who have put all this time and effort into the book. So the first one is Jordan, who is coming more from the Republican conservative side. He represents that in the book. He spent 5 years in the Marine Corps, including 2 combat tours overseas. He's got degrees, as you can see there, from Yale, Stanford, and Princeton. He is an entrepreneur now and a philanthropist based out of New York City. And then you can see Christopher as well. Christopher Haugh is representing more of the Democratic liberal side in the book. He's got degrees from the University of California at Berkeley, as well as Yale Law School, where they met. He was an intern in the White House working in the speechwriter's office, and then he carried that over into the U.S. Department of State. Now he's a writer who is based out of San Francisco. So looking forward to having these guys on and talking to them. Let's do that now. Welcome, Christopher and Jordan. How you guys doing?
Doing great. Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Awesome. So, Christopher, can you kind of explain for people who haven't read the book yet, like, what is the actual narrative? How did you guys come together, and what were you trying to capture in the book?
Absolutely. Well, the book is about a series of 6 road trips Jordan and I took across the country. We hit 44 states and nearly 20,000 miles. And they really just began as 2 friends driving across country. We met in law school in Connecticut. And after the year was up, Jordan sort of, we met early in the year, and Jordan sort of looked over, slapped me on the shoulder and said, "Hey, do you want to go on a road trip?" He had to be in LA for a summer job, and I had nothing better to do before my job in DC started a few weeks later. So I said, why not? And, this was in 2015, 2016. And so we had become friends before this, amazingly fractious election really took off. But by the time we actually took off on this first road trip, it had gotten really bad. And it was really hard to be friends across the aisle. It almost felt transgressive. It almost felt like we weren't supposed to be friends. So in some ways, this road trip, even though, there's no book in it at first, it really was our attempt to justify this friendship, to find reasons to continue to be buddies. And the first time we went out, it was just so important. We had these amazing conversations. We met such interesting people. The road was so beautiful that we said, hey, we should keep doing this. This might be our answer. And so we kept doing it and doing it and doing it.
Yeah. And so how about you, Jordan? Like, what's your perspective, and how did this come to fruition for you?
Well, Chris captured it pretty well. I think that first year together at Yale Law School, it was only about 7 months before we took to the road. It was this amazing shift to see among the student body, where earlier in the year, everybody is making new friends. They're engaging on deep topics that really matter, things like philosophy and literature and the values we care about and the careers we want to have. And then all of a sudden, the election dominated everything. And we found that every conversation we would end red in the face. And as someone who had served overseas, I cared a lot that America was viewed as good. And I also cared that we didn't descend into partisan conflict. I'd seen overseas how vicious partisan and tribal warfare can get. And I was worried that we'd start seeing it here. And Chris, as someone who had worked at the State Department and really believed in the idea that politics stops at the water's edge, that you could quote Reagan and Kennedy in the same speech, and that's great. We found kind of common ground on this idea that we wanted to avoid the worst of partisan conflict. And on the road, we found that things quieted down. We were able to have these much better, deeper conversations away from kind of all the noise of politics.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's fascinating. You guys are both talking about partisanship and the election back in 2016, and now we're living in that world again today. I mean, it's just as vicious, I'd say, if not more so now than it was back then, and especially over the next few weeks as we get closer and closer, and the early voting starts here in just a few days in certain states, and then all the millions of dollars that are getting pumped in. I live in Florida, so I'm seeing it every single day driving to work, and of course you turn on the TV, it's there. But let me ask you this, Jordan. It seems today that the political narrative right now is all about winning. It's all about the polls. It's all about who's leading, who's going to come out on top. What's that going to mean? If it's a close election, is it contested? Like, that is the talk. And yet, in your book and in what you guys just said, you talk about the importance of common ground. So, and obviously that's in the title as well. So let me ask you, why is common ground worth searching for? Why is it valuable?
It's a great question. And I just to step back to what you said at the beginning, when Chris and I wrote this book, we couldn't imagine that 2020 would be even more partisan than 2016, and yet here we are today, where it does feel like it's even worse, and that the election feels existential. And I've never felt so much uncertainty around an election before in my life. That the day after the election, we might not know who the president is for some time, and that's a very scary thing. I think it is amplified by the partisan fever that we've seen just accelerate over the last year. And the reason common ground is so important, in my view, you could call it by any number of names. You can call it civility. You can call it patriotism. It doesn't matter what you call it. But in the end, I think what Chris and I came to believe is that living together as a country, as a people, is necessarily fractious, because we're not all going to agree. But there's actually this moral value in being together as a community, as a society. And in order to do that, you have to be able to hear the other side. You have to treat them as someone worthy of respect and dignity, that has views and experiences that are worth engaging with. And even if we never agree on policy, that respect allows us to coexist in society. And when that breaks down, there's nothing stopping us from turning to violence to win, because it does become all about winning, and giving up the levers of power to the other side is dangerous, because we don't trust what they're going to do with it. And I worry that increasingly we're heading down that road, that we don't see the other side as worthy of dignity. We don't trust that they have good faith or intentions, or that they want, kind of at the end of the day, the same shared values that we hold. Yeah. And so as a result, like the potential for violence goes up. And so, the idea of civility or bipartisanship kind of gets sneered at. But I think Chris and I view it as this deeply moral project to find dignity in the other side.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And I want to get Christopher's thoughts on it as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, if I was just going to add, it's enormously relevant to our daily lives as well. I mean, this was a revelation to both Jordan and I. I mean, originally this was an idea that we had this friendship. We wanted to go out there. We wanted to prove that this is something that could exist in the 21st century. But every time we tell someone about this book, we hear these stories of, I can't wait to read it, because, I grew up in a conservative family, and now I work almost entirely with sort of liberal leaning individuals, or I've got this cousin who I grew up with and who's my best friend, and now we can't talk because, we stand on opposite sides of the political aisle. So it's not even necessarily a political project. I mean, I think it has great relevance to, the election of 2020, but it's also how tens of millions of liberals, tens of millions of conservative, tens of millions of people who don't know what the heck they are going to exist, are going to live and raise children and order food. I mean, everything is going to be at stake, and if we don't find a language where we can agree on at least some basics, then we're, I don't know what we're going to do. We're somewhat doomed. I mean, this politics isn't going anywhere. America is not going anywhere, and we have to learn to coexist, even if it's not necessarily our first political project.
So that's absolutely fascinating, because I want to kind of focus on that, because you both are talking about trying to essentially save America, save the American experiment, and how important dialogue is. So let's take that narrative, and I want to contrast it a little bit with some of the other narratives that you're going to see if you turn on the news or you turn on certain other channels, right? So starting from the right and many of the conservative outlets, Jordan, I'm going to give you a narrative, and you tell me what you think. And you tell me, the parts where you agree and disagree, because I hear it all the time. It's the notion that conservatives are patriots. Conservatives have the best interest of the country at heart, exclusively so. And liberals are bringing in a foreign ideology, socialism, right? Or something, even further to the left. There's some type of like Marxist, communism, and that they are enemies of the republic at its deepest levels, and should be defeated in any way possible. So, at the ballot box, or like prevented from protesting, whatever it is. So there's this notion that we as conservatives, you and I as conservatives, own this country, and that these people are trying to unjustly take it from us. So I hear that all the time. I see that, in conventions and speeches. What's wrong with that?
That's a great question, and I see the same things. I watch Fox News. I read op-eds from the National Review, and I think that the support for that position is that I think conservatives and Republicans are much quicker with the language of patriotism. That we resonate with the language of patriotism. We like to look at the country's history and speak with reverence about the great things we've done in the past, and that comes very naturally to us. And I don't think it comes as naturally to liberals and to Democrats. And it's not that they don't feel it. Also, it's that that language is just not the primary language they tend to use. And instead, I think what liberals do resonate with very deeply is the language of empathy and seeing our highest ideals, but also where we've fallen short. And they're pushing the country to live up to those ideals. And that's its own form of patriotism. It's saying that we've enshrined these values from the very beginning, and however imperfect we are today, we want to become more perfect tomorrow. And so let's move towards that. And I think that's something Chris has helped me understand deeply out on the road. And what ends up happening is, in that push for progress, you're going to be calling out the areas where America has fallen short, and you are going to point out the pocks and scars that we've had because of the rough history we've had. And it doesn't mean we're uniquely bad. Every country has had issues. We are actually uniquely good in the sense that we have values that we can point to and say, like, that's actually what we want, and we have a common language to do so with. And so that's where I think the vast majority of liberals and Democrats come from. Is they're trying to expand the American dream, the American bounty, the ideals we cherish more broadly across society, and they feel very deeply when people are left out from it. Yeah. Now, I think what ends up happening is that both sides will look at the fringes and try to identify the fringes with the whole. And so for the left, it's very easy for them to point at white supremacists or people at like the Charlottesville rally in 2017 and say, well, that defines the right. And on the right, we like to do the same thing. Yeah. We point at people who actually identify as Marxists, people who are advocating actual violence in the street, and say, well, that's defining the left. Yeah. And because of the binary nature of our political system, where everything is in some sense in a fight, it exacerbates the conflict, because we assume that the left's trying to tear down the country. They assume that we're trying to keep people out of the country, and it magnifies those narratives. But in the end, I would say that the vast majority of Republicans and Democrats exist in this middle, where we really do want what's best for the country. We're all patriotic. It just comes out in different languages.
Yeah. So one of the things that we do, we have a couple shows that we do on this channel. And one, we have a Democrat, we have me as a Republican, we have a Libertarian talk. And one of the first questions that I asked the Democrat was, all right, I'm just going to corner you. Do you love your country? Right? Like, yes or no? And of course he was like, yes. He's like, that's why I critique it so much. And I was like, okay, if you were in a relationship with someone and all you did was critique them, they would probably forget the fact that you love them. So maybe once in a while tossing a bone out here to, Uncle Sam might not be the worst thing in the world. So we have that kind of conversation in breaking that down. Christopher, I mean, is that kind of how you see it? Did he describe the left well, or do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Jordan's great at describing the left these days. Thank you, buddy. But I would only add, like, I mean, this is why I'm so happy to be here, to have a chance to talk across the proverbial aisle. Is that we need to see each other. We need to know that I'm a liberal. I'm with the long hair, and Jordan and I just wrote what we call a love letter to the United States. I mean, we are patriots, and I hesitate in saying it only because that's not the language that I grew up with, but the meaning behind it is something I absolutely grew up with. I mean, that it was in our language as as speechwriters. It's in our language now. We say it differently. We express it quite differently, but it's part and parcel of both of our visions for the country. And something Jordan has given me is a sort of encouraging me to embrace that, and it actually feels quite good, because I don't think there's any problem with being a patriot, as well as as critiquing, maybe not all the time like you're saying, but it's important to say these are our ideals, and this is how we can get there.
Yeah.
The last thing I'll say is driving across this country, you see that patriotism is equally distributed. It's the moderates, it's the radicals, it's the left, it's the right, it's the disinterested, and they'll all express it, but they'll express it in their own way. And I mean, that's actually a gift that I would say, once again, Jordan gave that to me. I was not looking for languages of patriotism. I was looking for these languages of empathy that Jordan was referencing. But you see all of it everywhere, and it's just a matter of being humbled in the face of all of that complexity and saying, people do feel the way I feel. People express it slightly differently, however.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. I mean, it makes me think about, so I grew up in the South, right? Deep South in Tennessee, and you were just conservative because, that was the culture. If you were, white, middle class, Protestant, then it was just until you tell someone otherwise. And we had a very stereotypical view of other areas, California, New England. My wife is from New England, and the first time I went up there, I expected everyone to be liberal, atheist, Democrat, the whole thing. And, and then I saw the diversity up there. We went up to New Hampshire, and it was very different than, say, Connecticut, and it was fascinating. I met her family, and sure, they talked different, but they were just as, hospitable and fun, and, accepted me in. And so there's this notion in your book, and I really love it, that travel and experience changes your perspective, right? And so that's one for me. I mean, I could mention others going overseas, going into Muslim countries and finding people that were just some of the sweetest I've ever met. How different is that than the stereotypes? So let me ask you this, Jordan. How, if you could try to describe it succinctly, I know there's so much to your work, but how are you different than when you started your journey? When you guys were on the road for, was it 3 years, I think, and all those miles and over 45, I think it was 45 states, right? How would you say that you were different as a person than when you started?
Well, I think it can all be boiled down to one sentence, which is, I think we walked away from these trips humbled by the country. And the beauty of travel is that you get out of your comfort zone, you see things firsthand on the ground, and it's always more complex than you could have imagined. I mean, just like you said, when you traveled overseas and you meet people who are different from the stereotypes you thought, the same is true, and we saw that every day out on the road across the country. And as you meet people and they defy whatever narratives are being blared through the media, it humbles you. You learn that people are just, they're very complex. They hold views and they've had experiences that have shaped how they're approaching issues. And there's a lot of wisdom and depth to those. Yeah. And over again, I think Chris and I just found that the more we saw, the more we recognized that things are complex, that we couldn't just whittle them down to easy talking points. And this gets to the Burkean philosophy that the world is complex, that people are complex, and it's only when you really see it on the ground that it truly hits you.
Huh. That's absolutely fascinating, and I love it when anybody mentions Burke, because that's what we kind of spend most of our show talking about. But it brings me kind of back to for you, Christopher, is I gave a narrative to Jordan, and I wanted him to kind of wrestle with it and critique it. And for you, there is kind of the Clinton narrative of there's this huge swath of the country that is deplorable and racist, and that defines far too many conservatives of the right, and it's kind of like believing that more than the extremes, there is this large number of people who have malevolence at heart and hate minorities. Going back to that example of when I have the other guys on the show, after I asked the Democrat, do you love your country? I asked the Libertarian, and the question for myself was, how do you feel about minorities? How do you feel about people, who are in lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender community. How do you feel about them, and do you love them or do you hate them? And we answer that question honestly, that of course we did love them, and I think that needs to come out. With Jordan talking about being humble, did your perspective of conservatives and people on the right change and grow during your journey?
Yeah, it'll come as no surprise that I say yes, absolutely. I mean, I grew up in Berkeley. I went to UC Berkeley for college. I've only ever lived in, DC, Berkeley, New Haven. I mean, these in liberal bubbles, and to get a chance to not only spend this quality time with Jordan, a close friend who admittedly I only knew for 7 months before we went on the road, but to really like grow that relationship over 3 years, to meet people like Pete, a truck driver from Daytona Beach, Florida, who we spent 5 days in his truck with, who was wearing a Make America Great Again shirt for 4 out of 5 of the days, I'm pretty sure. To meet others who express either conservative ideology or support for the president, whether it's the veterans in Page, Arizona, who we spent an evening with at their gun range, or even, a returning citizen in Detroit who told us that she supported Trump. It's inevitable that you're going to sort of run into people who upset the setup, who change your perspective on what the other side thinks, and of course it humbles you, and you see the complexity. It's impossible to put your finger on. You might be able to say, here's an average liberal, here's an average conservative, but no one ever sort of expresses all of those beliefs or all of those experiences in the same way. I mean, I remember Pete, who voted for the president, who supported him, was wearing this shirt. The first thing he said about politics was, I wish the president would talk more about climate change, which flummoxed me. I mean, if you're going to wear a MAGA shirt, that was not the first thing I thought you'd hear. And so, of course, like my coming away from this, I'm humbled by the complexity. I see the gray. I see the the compassion. And how Jordan talks about this country, and I see the basis of his patriotism being, love and a desire to make this country great. Yeah. And we might disagree on how to get there. We might disagree on policy, and we get very angry. Jordan and I still fight. I know the parties are absolutely still angry and don't see each other. But if we can take one step closer, by reading this book or by just committing to the project of common ground, then I think we can actually we can move forward. We can understand one another a lot better.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And I remember that, reading about Pete, and the thing that I got out most of reading that chapter was how you expanded him as more than just his vote, and it's this notion that people in their political life are more than just who they happen to decide, should be president for this election. Is that there is this ongoing discussion, the complexities you talked about, Jordan, with people. And I think that has to happen in terms of the conversations we're having now. That shouldn't just die after the election. We should continue working through these different issues and allowing people to, experience some level of disagreement. And it's, Jordan, kind of my last question here for you is, how do we do that in the conservative movement? It seems to me, and I've talked to George Will about this, I talked to Yuval Levin about it, and several others, of how do we, I just don't see a lot of diversity tolerated in the conservative movement. It is, you must absolutely agree that Donald Trump is the greatest president ever, or get off, the bandwagon. You have to absolutely agree with everything on the right-wing list, because could you imagine if they brought up Pete, in the RNC and had him talk, and he said what Christopher just, talked about, and he said, yeah, I think we need to focus more on climate change, he'd be booed off the stage, right? If he's on, a Charlie Kirk show or Ben Shapiro show, and he's talking about how important it is, he'd be told, why that's not one of the talking points, and they never do that. So how do we as conservatives, Jordan, kind of reinvest some of that diversity in our movement, as opposed to making it so closed-minded and single-minded?
That's a
tough, right?
Great question. Great question. I think my starting point on this, something I deeply believe, is that the Republican Party shifted under the conservative elite's feet without them realizing it. And it became a working class party without them seeing the shift. And the issues that resonate with the base are not the ones that the so-called elites have cared about for a long time. Yeah. And as a result, the ideas that have been kind of the bulwarks of the conservative movement for a long time are not what the base is responding to. And that doesn't mean the base is wrong. If anything, it means they're right and the elites are out of step. And the country as a whole is shifting. What we're looking to for government to solve, what we're looking to for our institutions to solve has changed significantly from 40, 50, 60 years ago. And, some of what we've built the last 50 years has worked really well for parts of the country, and it hasn't worked well for other parts. And we have to wrestle with that. And it's not enough to just have the good ideas from the last century and think they can be applied wholesale to today. We need new ideas. And so if the conservative movement does want to really become relevant again and to expand its tent, then I think what it needs to do is it needs to hear the voices that are on the right from the working class that are expressing the things they care about, things like more dignity, better work, a better relationship between the state and their labor, a definition of what it means to be a citizen, what are the rights and privileges. They articulate it different, but that's essentially what it comes down to with border security.
Yeah.
The relationship of the United States to the world. These are all things that the base they're expressing their views, and we just don't like how they're expressing it. Right. But the answer is not to call them rubes or idiots and make fun of them for voting for someone that the elites disagree with. I think the real answer is to start coming up with better ideas that capture the sentiment they have and put it into real, tangible words, articulate it in a way that people resonate with, but also moves us towards a better future. Yeah. And until we start doing that, no matter how much we talk about people like Russell Kirk or Edmund Burke or even Ronald Reagan, that's not going to move hearts. You need to move hearts, and the way to do that is to articulate in words the ideas that capture their imagination, but take us to a better place. And this is a very ripe time for big ideas. And I think that's where the intense focus should be.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And, I would add to that just, a couple of thoughts of we have to, you're talking about the importance of ideas and capturing imagination. And that kind of precludes this notion of this ad hominem that I feel like we're falling into is, don't listen to this guy because he's a rhino. Don't listen to this guy because he voted for Democrat once, right? Like, don't listen to this guy because, he made a mistake. And it's like, it seems like we're so quick to go after people personally whenever they say something that's against the narrative, as opposed to something that Yuval Levin has talked about of taking their argument at its best, right? Like actually considering what they're saying, even if it's against, your narrative, and trying to find the good points in it that maybe you can adopt, and kind of maybe it results in a softer narrative for you, but something that's more truthful as a result. So, I love that, man. For Christopher, my last question for you is, obviously you're an amazing guy. Look at this work. You're clearly open to these type of conversations, but it seems like even if it's a fringe, there is an element that seems to dominate the news today. When you look at some of these protests, you look at what happened in LA just recently, of it just going like way too far. And I think almost everyone agrees with that. How does the left, how should the left handle that? When you have people who are, attacking cops or standing in front of an emergency room, saying, we hope they die. I was looking on Twitter and there was people reposting it saying, absolutely, we need to make killing cops normal. How does the left survive and get a better narrative out when so much of that is dominating coverage today?
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard question. The same way that if we define any party or any movement by its fringes, we're gonna lose. It's not a recipe for a civil society. But I think the thing on the left is that we need to find, and I think this is a thing for any politician really that wants to unite this country, that wants to lead us into a future, is we have to find a story that unites both the pain that a lot of communities feel, and that goes for all sorts of communities, white working class communities, Black urban communities, all sorts of communities, as well as outcasting the worst behavior, the kind of behavior that none of us want to see in our streets. And I think that's the $1 trillion question. I mean, that is where we all need to be headed. And I think that's a really, really hard place to get. And I think to what you guys were just talking about, one of the ways that Jordan and I have tried to find a story that gets us closer to that is through the word of hope. We're big believers in hope, and what we say is that hope is an active form of optimism. It's not the belief that things will be better if we just cross our fingers and wait. It's things will be better if we roll up our sleeves and we work and we fight for it. And that theory kind of emerges out of John Lewis as much as a sort of Morning in America kind of message. I mean, it comes out of both of our camps, and I think that's a place where we can sort of draw people into a more constructive political dialogue and move away from the fringes, because the same way that like Jordan is not at all defined by what happens at Charlottesville, I hope that the left is not at all defined by the worst behavior at these protests. Yeah. One thing that we did see at the protests outside of the Trump rally is that the vast majority of those protesters were just there to hold signs and to speak their mind in a way that is enshrined in our Constitution, that is part and parcel of what it means to be an American. But then things went terribly wrong that night, and I've seen that happen at other protests before, and we got to find a way that we can draw the spotlight onto the people who are there to express their political view without breaking things. Yeah. And at the same time, we have to find that way of embracing that pain and being clear about where we've come from and where we want to go.
That's wonderful, man. I mean, what I was thinking the entire time you were talking is Martin Luther King. Like, and same for you, Jordan, is when you talked about capturing the imagination and purposeful activist hope. I grew up I told you in Tennessee. It was in Memphis is where I grew up. And I mean, just what an amazing guy who really took the reins on the narrative and just had that eloquence and can bring people together. And it just seems like I see more and more a growing frustration with how partisan and how hateful the rhetoric has become. And it's like now we need these leaders to come out of it who can channel what's true about that frustration, leave what's petty, leave what's shallow, and then formulate an actual solution to it in a leadership model around it that, like you guys said, is hopeful and stronger and frankly more mature. So I see that in what you guys are doing. I look up to you, and I'm just thrilled that you guys took time with me today. This is the book. It's called Union, and I really hope you guys pick it up. You can get it on Amazon. We're going to be giving away a free copy here. I want to show that to you. We're doing a little contest on our website. Kind of ask the question, how have your political views changed over time? So you can go on the BurkingConservative.com. You can answer that question there. And then here at the end of the month, right around the 1st of October, we're going to be giving away a copy of the book that's been signed by Jordan to at least one of our followers on that. We'll kind of read off that answer. But guys, thanks so much for spending this afternoon with me. I've got to batten down the hatches here. We got Hurricane Sally coming in Florida where I'm living. So I got to go handle that. But I am so thrilled that you guys spent some time. Really appreciate Jordan and Christopher spending the afternoon with me.
Well, thank you so much for having us. This was definitely one of the most thoughtful interviews we've had, which is no surprise from the man who calls himself the Burkean conservative. So thank you for having us, and stay safe, and hope to chat again soon.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.